Welcome to the Clinical Research Podcast. Every month we bring you the latest developments in research explained by our world-leading clinicians, academics and scientists based in Nottingham. In this episode, you'll hear about some of our research into long COVID. There's no obvious correlation yet between how seriously long COVID affects a patient initially and its longer-term effects. One of our research programs is trying to uncover why some people recover fully and quickly and why others may be affected far longer. Called NoRCoRP for Nottingham Recovery from COVID Research Platform, it was set up by Professor Ian Hall, the director of Nottingham Biomedical Research Centre, and includes a range of studies into the long-term effects of the illness. You're going to hear from him and his colleague Professor Charlotte Bolton. Like most of our researchers, they treat patients in the clinics here at Nottingham University Hospitals. They realised as long ago as last summer that some of the patients at the clinic had never been ill enough with COVID to be admitted to hospital initially, but they didn't necessarily seem to be getting much better.
So NoRCoRP is the Nottingham Recovery from COVID Research Platform. So the idea behind this is that what we're going to try and do is coordinate all of the clinical research which is going to be carried out in patients who have had COVID-19.
Some looking at recovery, and one of the key ones there is FOSP or PHOSP, which is a large study, a level 1B UKRI study led by Leicester and Professor Chris Brightling. It understands how patients are following a hospital admission for COVID-19 and takes a comprehensive assessment across function, across questionnaires, across detailed information taken during their hospital stay, and is taking place across 50 plus centres across the UK.
Patients who, for example, have had a spell in hospital with severe pneumonia, or perhaps have been unfortunate enough to have had to go to the intensive care unit, quite often have some significant scarring in the lungs and indeed may have problems in other organ systems. So they may have muscle weakness, they may potentially have heart problems or kidney problems as a consequence of having been to ICU. So these patients obviously will take some time to recover from that.
It also provides a platform, a registry for patients to then take part in further studies that myself and colleagues across the university and NHS will be taking part in to address each individual symptom in more detail.
I've been approached by a number of GPs about patients they have under their care who have significant problems 2 or 3 months after having had an episode of COVID-19. And so it's clear that even those patients who never came into hospital can have significant symptoms longer term. And at the moment, that's a gap in terms of our understanding of the long-term consequences of COVID-19, and NoRCoRP particularly addressed.
During the summer, we were probably quite ahead of the game in setting up a clinic for patients who had persisting respiratory symptoms so that they could be assessed, clinically examined, and a number of diagnostics and investigations take place to try and unearth why they were still breathless. COVID-19 causes the viral pneumonia, and so the most obvious long-term problems are those associated with lung scarring as a consequence of that pneumonia. And this is an area which is attracting quite a lot of attention. But COVID-19 also causes problems in many other parts of the body, including the heart, the brain, the kidneys, and the muscles. And these result in symptoms such as long-term headaches. They can cause problems with long-term muscle fatigue, weakness, and kidney damage. For some, it's understanding whether there's an element of scarring, whether there might be some of this fibrosis, this inflammation within the lung. For others, there may well be a post-viral spasm of the airways, some bronchospasm. In some, there may be persisting infection and inflammation that is taking time to settle. For others, mood may exacerbate the symptoms, but it's important to see if there's an underlying reason behind it as well. For others, there may actually have been an underlying lung problem that really only manifests itself with the acute infection and has become more predominant symptoms since then.
They may have ongoing cough. They often have muscle weakness, but fatigue is one really important symptom. So people are very tired and find it very difficult to get back to their previous levels of activity.
the severity of the initial illness doesn't relate to how long symptoms persist for. And actually the patients presenting from GP surgeries for diagnostic assessment are often young, white, and often without any pre-existing cardiovascular disease, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease prior to that. So there really is a real focus that we need to spend a large amount of research on to understand this in a lot more detail.
So the long-term questions which we really need to know the answers to, and of course it's too early to be able to give a definite answer to these problems, are how long will people continue to have symptoms if they've had mild COVID-19? How long will people continue to have symptoms if they've had more severe COVID-19, particularly if you've ended up on the critical care unit? So we know already that 2 or 3 months after severe disease, people have still got symptoms, and also that people who had relatively mild disease can still have symptoms at that sort of stage. We don't know whether or not these symptoms will resolve gradually, which is often what you see in patients who've had severe pneumonia, or whether or not they will persist, or indeed whether or not there are completely new collections of symptoms which will arise specifically in this group of patients. It's clear that even those patients who never came into hospital can have significant symptoms longer term, and at the moment that's a gap in terms of our understanding of the long-term consequences of COVID-19, and NoRCoRP will particularly address those.
We've been trying to understand why for some people it takes several weeks to several months to improve, and for others they bounce back to normal health really quite quickly. We have been investigating through a number of different studies how the longer term effects of COVID affect breathlessness, other respiratory symptoms like cough, but also how it affects the person, how it affects their activities of daily living, how it affects their function, how it affects their mood. And that's been through detailed questionnaires, detailed assessment, including standard things like blood pressure, oxygen levels, blowing tests called spirometry, walk tests, hand grip strength, and then relating that back to how they were in hospital.
Most of the evidence suggests over time that a lot of the damage caused by severe acute COVID does resolve, but some patients are certainly being left with significant impairment even some months after the initial episode. Particularly, for example, we're seeing patients who've got a lot of fibrosis in their lungs.
COVID-19 and the persisting symptoms have been a fantastic example of the team working together and working across job roles. So in the clinics, we have nurses, physicians, physiotherapists and researchers working together. And again, the BRC has enabled that, working with the NUH Trust, that we can have core clinicians. I have a fantastic occupational therapist, my registrar, Dr. Gupta, myself, assessing patients from a clinical perspective, and then I have a research physiotherapist, I have a project manager to enable the questionnaires and functional assessments to take place. Behind the scenes, I have a number of administrative staff that really are doing a huge amount of work in trying to address how we see patients most efficiently, particularly given all of the safety precautions we've got at the moment and keeping patients distanced in clinic, but how can we address the needs for each of those individual patients? We're far better informed to know how we can improve things and what best interventions will help patients get back to full health.
The Clinical Research Podcast is produced and presented by the Research and Innovation Department of Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust. You can find out more about our research and links to the information in this episode in the show notes.